Hey there, everyone. So today we're going to be looking at Zarathustra's prologue from Nietzsche's Spoke Zarathustra. And I'm going to do this because there's a lot of miscommunications and misunderstandings of Nietzsche that I think can be solved just by looking at the prologue in detail. So I'm going to be connecting their thoughts here to that of Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari in A Thousand Plateaus. I think there are several passages there that we can link to Thus Spoke Zarathustra in order to understand the legacy of this book, as well as some of the more esoteric themes. Something to understand about Nietzsche is that he often deals in paradoxes, and he purposely sometimes obfuscates a point that could be made clearer, but which would lose its clarity in trying to be made clear. Part of the clarity of Nietzsche is that it is esoteric, and that it is mysterious, and that it is extremely prosaic. And we can see this when we open up into Zarathustra's prologue, when Zarathustra comes out of his cave that he's been living in the mountains for 10 years, and he speaks to the star and he says, "You great star, what would your happiness be if you had not those for whom you shine?" And later says, "Bless me then, you tranquil eye that can behold even an all too great happiness without envy." And an important thing here to notice is he's almost appealing to the indifference of nature. That nature is naturally going to go through change and experimentation and perhaps even creative practices, and in a way that is not going to be totalized. This is sort of like the cosmic forces that Deleuze and Guattari speak of in the refrain plateau. When speaking to the sun, he says, "Like you, I must go under, as men say, to whom I shall descend." And oftentimes when we read Nietzsche, we get this master race kind of connotation, which is no doubt something that is there, in a sense, but also something that has been purposely misconstrued and pulled out of Nietzsche's writings by later fascists who wanted to adopt him. And I think it's important to notice, why exactly is he using "go under"? The word there is untergehen. And there's always going to be this dichotomy between under and over, unter and über. And this is the reason he uses the word Übermensch, the overman. And it's important to note the connotations of untergehen, of going under, because it's important to note that, in a sense, Nietzsche is utopian. He has this utopian vision for mankind as the Übermensch. But exactly how we get there is not by abstracting ourselves away from the world. I think this is one of the key links between Nietzsche and Heidegger, is Nietzsche is a very in der Welt sein philosopher, in the world being, or being in the world. He's about reality that's here and now. He's about tarrying with it and not abstracting it away into the transcendent. He is against transcendence, and we'll see that a bit later. But in terms of the word untergehen, he thinks that in order to attain freedom and knowledge, which are perhaps Nietzsche's two most important themes that he is seeking with the philosophy of the Übermensch, the word untergehen is the way by which we get there, and it has connotations of perishing or dying, but also of regeneration. And we could think of this kind of like the phoenix. It must go under before it can ascend to its next form, so to speak. And there's a similar German word that we find in the work of Hegel that has this connotation, which is Aufhebung or Aufgeben, which is translated usually as sublation. This is Hegel's process in which he sees all of history as a rational process. He sees it as always being guided by reason and rationality, which is inherent in the ontological order of things, and which propels contradictions to sublate themselves, which means for them both to perish, but also get carried on into the next moment of Hegel's dialectic. Now, Nietzsche is dialectical in a sense, but in another sense he's certainly not, because Nietzsche doesn't see this process as being defined by rationality or reason with a capital R. Instead, Nietzsche is ahistorical. And in terms of this ahistoricism, Deleuze and Guattari, on page 296 of A Thousand Plateaus, quote Nietzsche as saying, "The unhistorical is like an atmosphere within which alone life can germinate, and with the destruction of which it must vanish. What deed would man be capable of if he had not first entered into that vaporous region of the unhistorical?" And they go on to say, "Creations are like mutant abstract lines that have detached themselves from the task of representing a world, precisely because they assemble a new type of reality that history can only recontain or relocate in punctual systems." And this is exactly the kind of... Nietzsche doesn't want to divide history up into definite causal points, where one thing leads to the next in this rational historical process. Instead, it is merely a process of Untergehen, of going under, and by doing that, engaging with the world in a way in which we can become ahistorical, in which we can enter into change and relationships that can't be totalized. Now, as we move forward in the prologue, Nietzsche has this famous encounter with the saint as he goes down his mountain, and the saint mentions that he recognizes Zarathustra, and he states, however, that Zarathustra has changed. He said, "You lived in your solitude as in the sea, and it has borne you up. Alas, would you now climb ashore? Alas, would you again drag your own body?" Zarathustra answered, "I love mankind." "Why?" said the saint. "Did I go into the forest and the desert? Was it not because I loved men far too well? Now I love God. Man I do not love. Man is for me too imperfect a thing. Love of man would kill me." Zarathustra answered, "Did I speak of love? I bring men a gift." And this is an important aspect of Nietzsche's philosophy, which is that he is a post-humanist. He does not treat humanity as having this inherent value, as this static thing with rights and things like this. He sees humanity as a way to encounter a process, a form of an encounter itself. It is a way of engaging in a process of growth. So for Nietzsche, humanity is not loved for some inherent goodness or value within them, but as a method to engage in a process of growth for Zarathustra. And we might think this is selfish, and maybe that's the case, but it's important to notice that this is the beginnings of process philosophy, of seeing being or existence not as a stable form, but as something constantly being pressed up against by change and chaos and becoming something else. Now, the saint is precisely the kind of critique that Nietzsche is going to level against transcendence, but also against religion, which is that he sees the saint as trying to escape mankind so he doesn't get swallowed up by it. After all, he says, "Man is for me too imperfect a thing. Love of men would kill me." And for Nietzsche, he sees this as simply weakness. He sees this as an attempt to try to carry one's form beyond its expiration date, so to speak. It is to abstract oneself away so as to survive. And this hinges on the master and slave morality that Nietzsche talks about. That you're either a slave and you merely wallow in your pitiless condition and you try to find a way to turn it around via some kind of abstract transcendent metaphysic, or you engage in the master morality, which is to go under, to engage with the world, to become part of a process, to engage the fleeting and tenuous nature of everything. And in this way, this is the reason that he states in private that God is dead. Because for him, the transcendent is often used as an escape from reality. If we go beyond these things, if we realize that people in Nietzsche's time had long ago stopped acting like God was real in the sense that they turned to medicine or science when they needed help from an illness, or when they needed to make a change, they went to a parliament instead of praying. Like this kind of stuff, Nietzsche's pointing out that there are other ways in which we can engage in a process of change. And we do this by remaining in this world. Zarathustra reaches a nearby town and he sees a tightrope walker who's about to give a performance. And he says, "I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something that shall be overcome. What have you done to overcome him?" And this might seem quite contradictory because he's almost seems like he's doing the same thing as the saint and defaming mankind. But he's not defaming mankind, because the way in which one overcomes man and becomes, instead of Mensch, man, the Übermensch, the over-man. And it's important to note, Übermensch is not Superman. Superman is Supermensch. Übermensch is over as opposed to under man. We could almost make a dichotomy between Übermensch and Untermensch. And the way he wants to get past mankind and all of its dualisms and all of its conceitedness is by engaging with them. Not by abstracting away, but by entering into a process. And you might be wondering, what exactly is this over that we are trying to reach? This would be knowledge, peace, happiness, unity with all things, freedom. These are the kind of things that Nietzsche is trying to come towards. And he says, when he speaks of man as something that must be overcome, the word is überwunden there, he's not saying that we should abandon mankind, but that we have to engage in a process of uprooting the human and becoming transhuman. Hence the emphasis later on the transvaluation of all values, or, as he does it in another work, the genealogy of morals. He says, "The Übermensch is the meaning of the earth. Let your will say, the Übermensch shall be the meaning of the earth." And this is not meant to be considered some timeless, categorical, ethical imperative. Rather, it elucidates that the Übermensch is a future tense. Shall be as in, this is what is to come. So when he says the Übermensch shall be the meaning of the earth, he merely means that right now, the Übermensch is not the meaning of the earth, and it is something that we must create. He's going to make this emphasis on creation throughout that puts the burden of truth and knowledge and happiness and unity on our shoulders, instead of trying to take it off and put it on some transcendental form. We get a really great critique of transcendence when he says, "I beseech you, my brothers, remain true to the earth and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. They are poison mixers whether they know it or not. They are despisers of life, themselves the decaying and poisoned, of whom the earth is weary. So away with them." He's pointing out the fact that this is the slave morality, so to speak. This is someone who is in a decaying position, someone who is aware they are in a decaying position. And instead of accepting that, instead of rolling with the punches, instead of letting that current take them where they will, they reach for the otherworldly. As they're drowning, they reach a hand up and they search for a hand and imagine a hand. And by doing this, they try to formalize what is not formalizable. Nietzsche says later, "What is the greatest thing you can experience? It is the hour of great contempt, the hour in which even your happiness becomes loathsome to you, and so also your reason and virtue." And he's trying to point to this transvaluation of all things. That all that is formalized, like reason and virtue, will come to pass, which is an allusion to his idea of the eternal recurrence. That everything is always going to be changing, and that if we try to fight this, we end up creating totalitarian forms, like the state, for example. The state is something that Nietzsche is against, partially because he thinks, well, it's artificial. It doesn't represent the potentiality of mankind, and in fact, it goes against the potentiality of mankind by putting it into a box and by ensuring that it cannot escape from this box, that it is totalized, formalized, and shaped according to some will, which is the will to power. One of Nietzsche's more esoteric points comes when the tightrope walker starts his performance and Zarathustra speaks to people and he says, "Man is a rope stretched between the animal and the Übermensch, a rope over an abyss." So we have kind of a typical scene being set here, where we have man's worst on one end and man's greatest on the other, the Übermensch. And man is always on this narrow path in between them over an abyss, which is the nothingness of failing to achieve some transcendent purpose. So it seems like he's almost setting out here a transcendent idea of, well, this is what you should do. This is human nature, so to speak. But he goes on to say, a dangerous crossing, a dangerous on the way, a dangerous looking back, a dangerous trembling and halting. What is great in man is that he is a bridge and not a goal. What is lovable in man is that he is an overgoing and a going under. I love those that do not know how to live except by going under, for they are those who go over. And we get a sense of exactly what he's trying to say when we see a section on page 293 in A Thousand Plateaus, where Deleuze and Guattari say, "A line of becoming is not defined by points that it connects, or by points that compose it. On the contrary, it passes between points. It comes up through the middle. It runs perpendicular to the points first perceived, transversally to the localizable relation to distant or contiguous points. A point is always a point of origin, but a line of becoming has neither beginning nor end, departure nor arrival, origin nor destination. To speak of the absence of an origin, to make the absence of an origin the origin, is a bad play on words. A line of becoming has only a middle." And this is exactly what the Übermensch is. It is a line of becoming. Rather than treating mankind as something that has already been decided, as a definite point which sits in a particular historical situation and has a definite causal relation to everything, Nietzsche wants to imagine mankind as anti-teleological, which is to say it does not have a set telos or purpose or goal. It does not have a set thing to which it is driving towards, and thus it cannot be fully accounted for by history or causality. Something will always slip from the box, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. So instead, we're always already in the middle. We're between 2 points, and we're never going to reach that final point. The Übermensch is not a final destination. It is something which is reached through an ongoing process, through the eternal recurrence. If you think about the idea of the eternal recurrence, it doesn't stop. It's not an eternal recurrence until it's not eternal anymore. It's always an ongoing process, and hence the creation here of process metaphysics. It's always interesting to note Nietzsche's relationship to asceticism. Asceticism is often used in religious sects as a way to feign worldly pleasures in an attempt to get closer to the transcendent. But Nietzsche's idea of asceticism is a little different. It's being ascetic towards formalized things like the state or virtue or morality. Nietzsche says, speaking in the words of Zarathustra, "I love him whose soul is so overfull that he forgets himself, and all things are in him. Thus all things become his going under. I love him who has a free spirit and a free heart. Thus his head is only the guts of his heart. His heart, however, causes his going under. I love all who are like heavy drops falling one by one out of the dark cloud that lowers over man. They herald the coming of the lightning, and as heralds they perish. Behold, I am a herald of the lightning, and a heavy drop out of the cloud. The lightning, however, is the Übermensch." So here, Nietzsche is using certain themes of the dissolution of the subject. This idea that the binary between humanity and nature is in fact no binary at all. That in fact everything is engaged in a process, and it can be engaged in the same type of process. And Deleuze and Guattari will make this distinction between the process of metaphysics as capitalism and the process of metaphysics as schizophrenia, to highlight two different ways in which metaphysics can either go the transcendent way, which for Deleuze and Guattari is capitalism. This is a sort of infectious infecting of everything in order to turn it into some transcendent value and thus to try to formalize it. Or you have the schizophrenic mentality, which treats things as they come to them and tarries with reality instead of trying to get away from it. And we can see Nietzsche's importance of merely rolling with the punches because he says all things become his going under. The free spirit who lets things flow through him or her has all this cannon fodder for the possibilities of change. And this change is represented by the Übermensch, the lightning, which is that spark of change that allows something to engage in a historical break. Deleuze and Guattari point this out as being May 68 in France, for example. This mass protest in which almost a quarter of the French population was engaged in strikes, uprisings, protests. This kind of lightning can only occur by one who is so overfull with joy and affects, and he allows his heart to cause his going under. He allows himself to feel instead of pushing away feelings like the religious ascetic may do, and just say, these feelings are a part of my life. These are something that I need to tarry with instead of trying to get rid of. Nietzsche wants to highlight the fact that because mankind is a bridge and not a goal, because he's a process, he cannot be defined with some set nature. There is always something which slips out of the box, as Deleuze and Guattari put it. Nietzsche says, I tell you, one must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star. I tell you, you still have chaos in yourselves. And this is an important part of Nietzsche's philosophy, which goes on especially to influence the French Nietzscheans that come after him, like Deleuze and Guattari, or Jacques Derrida, or Michel Foucault, or Jean Baudrillard, is that they want to emphasize chaos, madness, disgust, these often horrendous themes, which showcase the fact that mankind can't be tied down. There's always chaos that can't be totalized because everything is always engaged in a process of change. Think about a city. A city cannot be fully self-sufficient precisely because land cannot be reaped infinitely before it becomes dysfunctional. Cities must expand and they must have a parasitic relationship on the societies around it, on the land around it, on the people around it. And because of this, stable forms are actually going to try to get rid of chaos, but in actuality, it will not be. We have all these ancient societies which are no longer, and they always happen to be in deserts, because they used to not be a desert, but they worked their land till it became a desert. And this is part of the problem that Nietzsche sees with the transcendent, is that it defames existence to the point of destroying it. And Nietzsche is terribly life-affirming. This is an important part of his philosophy, is he is not a nihilist, at least in the traditional sense of, like, oh, nothing has a purpose and therefore you should just kill yourself. There's nothing important about life. Nietzsche will deny that there is an objective, transcendent purpose that has been given to us. But he doesn't mean that this makes life non-valuable. Instead, life becomes valuable. Life becomes in general. Humanity becomes. And this is kind of always latent within humankind. And Deleuze and Guattari use this in a similar way to Nietzsche to focus on art as a potential for change. Deleuze and Guattari say on page 295 of A Thousand Plateaus, one elaborates a punctual system or a didactic representation, but with the aim of making it snap, of sending a tremor through it. A punctual system is most interesting when there is a musician, painter, writer, philosopher to oppose it, who even fabricates it in order to oppose it, like a springboard to jump from. And thus, Nietzsche is going to have this emphasis on creating. And Nietzsche thinks that this can come from all kinds of forms. There's this little section which I can tell that Foucault used in his Madness and Civilization, in which Nietzsche is talking about the last man. And the last man is really the postmodern condition. He says, "Behold, I show you the last man. What is love? What is creation? What is longing? What is a star?" So asks the last man, and he blinks. The earth has become small, and on it he hops, the last man who makes everything small. His species is ineradicable, like that of the flea. The last man lives longest. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and blink. They have left the regions where it was hard to live, for one needs warmth. One still loves one's neighbor and rubs against him, for one needs warmth. Becoming sick and being suspicious are sinful to them. One proceeds carefully, and he goes on to mention, formerly all the world was insane, say the subtlest of them and blink. One is clever and knows all that has happened, so there is no end of derision. And we can see this in both the themes of Jean Baudrillard and Michel Foucault, where Baudrillard points out the fact that in movements, and maybe this is a bit controversial, but he points out that, for example, we have things like the right to life movement, or one has the right to a certain quality of life. And Baudrillard sees this in a similar way to Nietzsche, as a way to escape hardship. And Nietzsche, similar to Jean Baudrillard, is against egalitarianism because he thinks that nature is not egalitarian. He thinks that nature is always destroying things, and that by failing to understand that this destruction is everywhere, we turn ourselves into this empty husk, some sort of transcendent form whose only job is to die a timely death, as Jean Baudrillard says. They say that they've invented happiness, but of course the last man is going to decide what happiness is for everyone, and everyone who doesn't engage in that is not mankind. They think that being sick or being mad is something of the past, something to be suspicious of. And Nietzsche rightly calls this a form of derision. And Michel Foucault will take this to say, well, we try to get rid of madness and we use it as a way to obfuscate people without realizing that madness is integral to what it is to exist. Nature is mad. Mankind is mad. Animals are mad. At one point, the tightrope walker falls from his tightrope to the ground right next to Zarathustra, and his body is weak. And he tells Zarathustra that he's worried about dying. He doesn't want to go to hell. And Zarathustra's like, don't worry, hell's not a real place. And Zarathustra responds to him by saying, you have made danger your calling. There is nothing contemptible in that. Now you perish by your calling. For that I will bury you with my hands. And it's important to note that this can be taken in 2 degrees. We can interpret this extremely metaphorically, which is to say that one always engages in processes that allow one's personality to develop and change, that you make the danger of the next day your calling and kind of become a thrill seeker in the loosest sense. Or we can take this in a very extreme sense to say you make danger your calling and you become irrationally stupid and you engage in processes that will knowingly lead to your death. This is not what Nietzsche has in mind, and Deleuze and Guattari call this the abstract line of death. This is where you become such a free spirit to the point where you abandon any sense of belonging anywhere in an effort to simply destroy yourself. And they see this as a very dangerous nihilism, which I think Nietzsche sees too, because Nietzsche is a very life-affirming philosopher, just like Deleuze and Guattari. And Nietzsche thinks that everything is always living in the sense of it's always changing. That is what defines life. If you're not growing or engaged in a process, you're dead. I mean, that's how biology, like if your heart stops pumping, if your lungs stop working, if your brain stops functioning and becomes static, you don't become the master race. You're dead. So Nietzsche's here emphasizing a very commonsensical point, which is that you've always got to be moving. You've always got to accept the fact that you will be moving. And how are you going to deal with that? Zarathustra takes the body, which dies, of the tightrope walker, and he walks with it for miles. And in a sense, we can see this as a very Jesus-like way of interacting with the lowest among us in order to come to a fuller picture of mankind. That he's engaging with madness, with sickness, with death, things that are written off in society. But Nietzsche's going to realize that the way he's treating this tightrope walker, this thing which has become a corpse, he realizes later that it's not going to be the greatest for him. And we get a little bit of a learning lesson here. When Zarathustra is in night and the wind's blowing hard, and it's just him and the body. And Zarathustra says, "Truly Zarathustra has made a fine catch of fish today. It is not a man he has caught, but a corpse. Human life is uncanny and as yet without meaning. A gesture may be fatal to it. I want to teach men the sense of their existence, the Übermensch, the lightning out of the dark cloud of man." So here it's like he sees a potentiality in the corpse, in taking out of the corpse some lightning, some potential, some force. But later on, we're going to see that he actually starts to change his mind about this. And at one point, Zarathustra finds an old man and he asks for some food. And the old man comes back with some bread and his wine, and he gives some to Zarathustra. But the old man also says, "But bid your companion eat and drink also. He's wearier than you." Zarathustra answered, "My companion is dead. I shall hardly be able to persuade him to eat." "That does not concern me," said the old man sullenly. "Whoever knocks at my door must take what I offer him. Eat and be off." And this is Nietzsche's critique of grace as it appears in Christianity, for example. He thinks that this is a slave morality, that this man is in a bad position, and in order to make himself feel better, he just undiscriminatorily gives to whoever passes by. And we rightly see this as stupid in the story. The corpse is dead. The food doesn't matter to him. And this is Nietzsche's problem, is that he thinks it takes self-fulfillment and selfish pleasure and turns it into a virtue. Instead of being pragmatic and saying, well, he's dead. We don't have to give food to everything. So this is kind of Nietzsche's little critique of egalitarianism and grace in there. But after a while, Zarathustra goes to sleep, and he sleeps into the morning of the next day, and his eyes opened, and amazed he gazed into the forest and the stillness. Amazed he gazed into himself. And this is the kind of heralding of the unity with nature or chaos. That mankind must become closer to that which is historically feigned away as something alien to mankind. This trying to come back into union with nature by recognizing the similarities between nature and oneself. And this often happens when you look into nature and you see some kind of similarity to yourself. You see the vicissitudes of the seasons, and you see all sorts of various knots in trees, and things have fallen over, and maybe it reminds you of some event in your life where something has fallen over, or where you've had a rainy day as kind of a metaphor. But then, there's the sunshine to come next, right? There's this silver lining around every cloud kind of thing. And this is exactly the kind of process that Nietzsche wants to engage in, but he realizes that he can't just do this with the corpse. Zarathustra says, "An insight has come to me. I need companions, living ones, not dead companions and corpses, which I carry with me where I please. But I need living companions who will follow me because they want to follow themselves, wherever I please. To lure many from the herd, for that I have come. The people and the herd shall be angry with me. Zarathustra wants to be called a robber by the shepherds." And this is the lovely part of Nietzsche's philosophy, which is radical. It loves to be extreme. It loves to be a destroyer. And one of the most paradoxical parts of Nietzsche's philosophy is that for him, destruction is productive. He says, "Behold the good and just. Whom do they hate the most? The man who breaks their tablets of virtues, the breaker, the lawbreaker. He, however, is the creator. Behold the believers of all faiths. Whom do they hate the most? The man who breaks their tablets of virtues, the breaker, the lawbreaker. He, however, is the creator, and he goes on to do this for a number of other things. But the point here is that, as Deleuze and Guattari say on page 277, the only way to get outside the dualisms is to be in between. So the only way to get outside of good and evil, to try to realize that, okay, one is always a little evil, or one is always a little bit mad. In order to get between madness and sanity, good and evil, you have to break those categories. You have to engage in a process of destruction in which one destroys in order to create one's own. And this is the free part of Nietzsche's philosophy, is that it is engaged in a process that one decides on one's own terms, precisely by failing to yield, failing to be totalized, or failing to be completely understood by some sort of system. And an important thing to note about when we talked about being in between the dualisms is that both Nietzsche and Deleuze and Guattari see this in between as passing between dualisms which exist. It's not about escaping dualisms necessarily, but by recognizing the faces of the dualisms, so to speak. That's the words that Deleuze and Guattari use when they talk about faciality. And turn truth into something transitory, into something that's always going to be changing, into something circumstantial, and turn it into a process which passes between dualisms, not beyond dualisms. We're always in the world. We're not passing beyond the world. And we're not trying to escape dualism as such. We're just escaping particular dualisms. We are creating new dualisms, and in that process, exercising one's freedom by creating things that didn't exist before. Zarathustra speaks of writing new values on new tablets. And this is probably the most important connection between Nietzsche and Deleuze and Guattari, is this impetus to create, to experiment, as Deleuze and Guattari say. To treat the possible as something which has never been exhausted, something which is always an ahead of oneself. Deleuze and Guattari say on page 269, Zarathustra is only speeds and slownesses, and the eternal return, the life of the eternal return, is the first great concrete feeling of non-pulsed time. And Deleuze and Guattari have tried to make this distinction between pulsed time, which is like formalized musical form or definite points in history, and instead think of non-pulsed time, ahistorical time, or whatever you want to call it. That there's only speeds and slownesses of change. How quickly or how slowly are values being done away with? And this is the eternal return, rightly. This is always returning back to some territory, but in order to use it, like Deleuze and Guattari have said before, as a springboard, as something which is going to encourage further change. Now, at the very end of the prologue, Zarathustra sees in the sky an eagle swept through the air in wide circles, and on him there hung a serpent, not as prey, but as a friend, for she kept herself coiled round the eagle's neck. And there's this constant imagery throughout of the eagle, which is going to symbolize freedom, and the snake, which is going to symbolize knowledge. We often think that the snake is like evil because of like Genesis in the Bible and stuff, but no. The snake has traditionally symbolized knowledge. I mean, even in the Bible, the snake is getting us to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And there's this important symbolic messaging about the union between truth and freedom. Because we tend to think of freedom as not being constrained by anything. Whereas we tend to think of truth as probably being the most constrained, because truth either is true or it's not true. It is the most constrained thing possible. There is no room for variation. But in fact, for Nietzsche, freedom is the truth, and the truth is freedom. The truth is always free of any form, and freedom is always the truth of metaphysics, of nature. Freedom to change, freedom to engage in chaos. And this is really the genesis of these themes of process, change, transitoriness, becoming, which Deleuze and Guattari will use. And Deleuze and Guattari actually give us the sort of paradoxical formula that Nietzsche will use. They say, on page 20, we invoke one dualism only in order to challenge another. We employ a dualism of models only in order to arrive at a process that challenges all models. Each time mental correctives are necessary to undo the dualisms we had no wish to construct but through which we pass. Arrive at the magic formula we all seek. Pluralism equals monism. Via all the dualisms that are the enemy, an entirely necessary enemy, the furniture we are forever rearranging. So it's important to note, we're never trying to get outside of dualism in general. We're always going to pass through dualisms, but it's important to use these mental correctives and undo these forms which are being imposed upon us. We invoke one form, one idea, in order to challenge it by another, and to engage in a process of passage, and challenge all formalized models, challenge all attempts to be totalized, and engage in a pluralistic process, all this multiple different forms we're engaging in order to reach a monism of becoming, a unitary process, so to speak, which is forever rearranging the furniture of ontology. And we can see the reason that Zarathustra wants to engage with mankind is he says, I have found life to be more dangerous among men than among animals. On dangerous paths walks Zarathustra. Let my animals lead me. He wants to willingly engage in danger. He wants to willingly engage in a process, in change. And he says, would that I were wiser. Would that I were wise from the very ground like my serpent. But I'm asking the impossible. Therefore I ask my pride to go always with my wisdom. And if my wisdom should someday forsake me, it loves to fly away. May my pride then fly away with my folly. This is pure, vertiginous, insatiable production in unity with the becoming of the animal and the earth. So I hope this has given you some help in processing this process, which is Nietzsche's philosophy and Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy. Leave any constructive criticism or non-constructive criticism in the comments, and I'll see you in another lecture.